If you guys remember, back in late 2022, early 2023, I ran a mini-series on the current state of affairs across Genshin's 7 elements, detailing how they're doing, the status of their characters, their involvement in the meta, and what are some challenges they were facing. The one element I never made an episode on was Cryo, having talked about the other 6 in great detail and even revisiting a few of them. Looking back, I felt like there wasn't a clear answer for the ice element. On one hand, it was nowhere quite as dominant back in 2021, but on the other, I felt like it would have been premature to say the element fell off in its entirety. That being said, in light of recent discussions on the apparent absence of reruns for most Cryo units, and after having made a retrospective on Ganyu and Ayaka, I think prevailing wisdom has reached a consensus on where Cryo currently stands. Cryo is in a bad spot. You might say they've been frozen in place while the other elements have evolved and innovated in their own way. Interestingly, Cryo is tied with Pyro for the highest number of characters at 15 each, and yet it's the only element without a single character in the apex tiers of the game, despite having been considered the strongest element at one point. In a way, it still theoretically is the strongest element if you can meet the conditions for it, but with how things have been going for Cryo, it might be time to finally talk about it. Today we'll be discussing the current state of Cryo and how it slowly but surely died out in popularity. This element is a perfect example of what happens when you design a mechanic so binary and so game warping that it becomes practically impossible to find a level solution for it where it's good enough to be worth building into, but not too good to where it stifles other options. It's also a perfect example of what happens when you stake everything on one thing and have nothing else to fall back on. What has allowed elements like Hydro and Electro to mature so well over time is that those elements are nothing if not versatile. Known for having a wide spread of reactions, they can capture positive attention directed anywhere and capitalize on it themselves. It's the Shenling effect essentially, where anything and everything can be interpreted as an indirect buff to Hydro, Electro, Animo, what have you. Back in the day, the two strongest offensive elements were Pyro and Cryo as a result of their strong and simple reactions. For Pyro, it was Vaporize and Melt. For Cryo, it was Melt and Freeze. Now, before 1.6 equalized transformative reactions to be as good as amplifying ones in value, those 3 reactions effectively dominated the meta for all of version 1, and even throughout most of version 2. Reason for that was because of how straightforward the reactions were in relation to the output they gave. No reaction epitomized that simplicity more than Freeze. Freeze is the elemental reaction triggered by inflicting Cryo on a target affected by Hydro or vice versa, causing targets to become stuck in place for a certain period of time, unable to move or attack. While the reaction does go on further to have a shatter component to it whenever struck by a blunt or geo attack, most of its importance comes from the frozen component itself. Consider the implications of enemies being unable to move or attack. Not only does this contribute towards a party's defensive faculty in that you don't need to worry about survival if you never get hit, but it also works towards a party's offensive benefit. With the enemy completely still, you can free fire on them during that time. Freeze itself dealt no extra damage, but it was still one of, if not the most effective reaction in the game for essentially invalidating all semblance of challenge and difficulty when fighting an enemy. By repeatedly applying instances of Cryo and Hydro onto a target, you were able to refresh the freeze aura on them over and over, perpetually stunning them in place. Funnily enough, continuous freeze has diminishing returns based on gauge theory and other ancillary factors, but in application, if you just throw enough Hydro and Cryo at a target, you'd be none the wiser to it since enemies will remain frozen anyway. The impact of such a power was made self-evident right away. Part of what contributed to Ganyu and Ayaka's monumental success was how, not unlike Zhongli, those two transformed any Chamber of Spiral Abyss or the vast majority of overworld domains into Minecraft peaceful mode. Emphasizing how easy this was to perform was the fact that Cryo's units are known for persisting effects. Diona, Rosaria, Ayaka, Shenhe, Ganyu, Kaya, even Qiqi. Most of the early Cryo units had a skill or burst that persisted for a long stretch of time, periodically applying Cryo to all nearby targets, and with decent coverage at that. Not only was Freeze exceptionally powerful, but Cryo's roster was exceptionally efficient at achieving Freeze, creating a very polarized meta where if a character had mobs that could be frozen, you had no reason not to bring Ayaka or Ganyu, as they could wipe the floor with Spiral Abyss in record time. Therein lies the central issue with the element that's been plaguing it for the past almost 3 years now. Arguably the most challenging dilemma with Cryo is that the freeze reaction cannot be dealt with in the same way the others can, for one simple reason. It revolves not around dealing more damage, but around a crowd control effect. For a weaker elemental reaction like Overload, you can create a unit who specializes in amplifying the efficiency of that team. But for Freeze, the task is not how much power you can put into that reaction or how many times you can set that reaction off, but whether it activates or not. It's a yes or no question. The problem is, when yes consists of the enemy being rendered completely unable to attack or move, the repercussions are so influential and consistent that, optimally speaking, you have no reason to do anything else. There's no way to balance it to make it less efficient because it's a switch. It either works or it doesn't. You might propose maybe a freeze cooldown preventing you from chain freezing enemies, but that kinda goes back to the original aspect of freeze being either on or off. The biggest selling point of freeze is that you can keep it on forever. Making an enemy freezable only for certain intervals is no different from them being immune to freeze. There is no way you can bounce a reaction in its current state to not be either overpowered or completely irrelevant. Why this negatively impacts the element is because most cryo units were designed around easily achieving freeze. So when the reaction itself got compromised, so too did basically the entire cryo roster. Over the years, characters have been introduced in other elements who are partial to certain reactions and themes. On the flip side, let's take a look at the strongest element in the game, Hydro. Though most of its cast members are mainly concerned with Vaporize, its fluidity renders many of its units capable of facilitating its other reactions, Swirl, Electrocharge, Freeze, and Bloom. By extension, that allowed Hoyo to institute characters who vary from one another, like Nilu who dives headfirst into Bloom, and Molani who's into forward Vaporize. Another instance of this can be seen within Electro, whose units are at present evenly distributed between Aggravate and Hyper Bloom, with some of them also playing into Overload. For the most part, the cost-benefit of any option is about the same. In Cryo's defense, Melt has always been a viable strategy to go for on paper, but circumstantially, not only was it a far less consistent option than the extremely consistent freeze, but once again, the payoff from chain freezing was just so much better than what any of Cryo's other reactions could offer. Exacerbating this was that hardly any infrastructure was put in place to facilitate Melt, while too much infrastructure was put in place to facilitate freeze. Cryo Swirl also spreads Cryo to nearby enemies, for example, making it way more conducive to freeze than Melt. With all this taken into consideration, Freeze has an effective stranglehold over the element, forcing every one of its characters to subscribe to it if they harbor even the slightest chance of being usable. On that note, there are 3 factors responsible for the lack of popularity with Reverse Melt. Problem 1. Cryo units have never been known for strong single instance burst damage. Amplifying reactions use the triggering attack as a variable being amplified by the coefficient of either 1.5 or 2 times. It's in your best interest to have as strong of an attack as possible set off the reaction to get the most value out of it. While some members might have a decently strong singular attack like Ayaka's skill or Ganyu's level 2 charge arrow, you can't find the same kind of big damage nukes on par with the likes of Utal's burst, Milani's burst, Diluc's plunging attacks, what have you. And there's actual thematic reason behind it. Fire has always been the element of power in video games, raw destructive force, whereas ice has always been the element of permanence, a constant stasis-like presence. Those two have been the antithesis of each other for as long as they've been used in fantastical literature. Phrases such as going down in a blaze of glory signify an ephemeral, short-lived, yet powerful impression, just like how pyro characters are all about quick bursts of extreme damage. In contrast, metaphors like frozen in time signify a complete standstill, something always being there, persistent, which is illustrated by many cryo units having effects that remain on field for long stretches of time and the very freeze reaction itself keeping enemies still. It doesn't make much thematic sense for cryo to be the power behind the operation, leading me to the second problem. Problem 2. The surrounding infrastructure for a proper reverse melt engine doesn't really exist at the moment or is impractical and inefficient. Even if units like Ganyu and Risley can achieve melt, you need setup on the other end as well. Shenling is about the only pyro unit with enough pyro application to allow cryo to be the triggering attack. Either that or you spec into a burning team at the risk of your own life. Additionally, the only way to VB shred on cryo is by forcing a double swirl, which is difficult to consistently perform in and of itself. That's because cryo is the last element in terms of priority for elemental absorption. If you have Bennett on your team, which you most certainly will if you're going reverse melt, Bennett's like de-amplifying reaction support. Kazuha will end up absorbing pyro instead. We do have Shilonen now who addresses that issue though, so that should help out a bit. But currently, pulling off reverse melt just takes a lot more work with a lot more conditions as opposed to vaporize, which is much easier to do, much more plentiful in terms of support, and has a proper infrastructure built in place to encourage it. The reason I compare vaporize and melt is because the final problem is that reverse melt is just an alternative to reverse vaporize. If you're searching for a reaction that gives your attacks 50% more damage, vaporize has been established for a long time at this point. They practically have the same end result, it's just you replace cryo with hydro. While transformative reactions ultimately consist of just damage, they tend to have a range of other properties that can help with either frequency, ease of access, coverage, and whatnot. Amplifying reactions have no supplementary effects, they're just multipliers, nothing more, nothing less. With vaporize being much more accessible, pragmatically all you're doing is choosing a more difficult and inconsistent form of it by going melt. Accounting for what I just went over and then comparing it to how much easier, more impactful, and more unreplicable freeze is, it's no wonder virtually every cryo unit was, for better or worse, made for the express purpose of freezing enemies. That's the problem with the element. They bet everything on freeze, a reaction so powerful and so invalidating that when it's allowed to operate at full capacity, it is the single best reaction ever. But when it's not allowed to operate at full capacity, it doesn't exist. It's either god mode or useless, no in between. During its prime, Ayaka and Ganyu were two of the best attackers in the game. Despite not receiving any increase in personal DPS through freeze, just being able to keep enemies in place allowed for fast and efficient clears as you didn't have to waste time chasing after enemies or dodging attacks. When Shunho came out, she became the supplemental damage cryo needed to excel, and the 3 characters occupied a substantial amount of market share up until Dendro. While the increase in damage floor and ceiling throughout version 3 put a dent in Frieza's capability, it was still invaluable for how easy it was to clear content, and so Hoyo began to realize the only way they could quote-unquote balance the reaction was to straight up not let it be usable. Bosses and frozen immune enemies became commonplace throughout Spiral Abyss beginning in version 2, and then getting increasingly more prolific in versions 3 and 4. We always had the good old Cryo Slimes and Abyss Mages that couldn't be frozen, but then they added stuff like the Kairagi, Cryo Abyss Herald, Consecrated Beast, Cryo Specters, and that one Hydro enemy that can't be frozen, the name's escaping me at the moment, not to mention bosses being implemented in virtually every floor. Similarly to how they made Abyss Chambers specifically to counter Venti's outstanding ultimate, they made Chambers specifically to stop you from cheesing them with Freeze. Like in version 4, they added the Coppelius boss like 5 times to discourage the use of Ayaka and Ganyu. Even if you brought someone with an arc alignment, they still have like 95% cryo res or something ridiculous. Nowadays, you'd be lucky to find a chamber, much less a floor, without a frozen immune enemy. As a result of the reaction losing most of its meaningful usability, the entire element has effectively been shoved down a peg. Ayaka and Ganyu were once the pièce de résistance of any player's Abyss clearing pool. Nowadays I've noticed Abyss data showing even Dia being used more than them. Wristlight's about the only one chilling in double digits. Not a single cryo unit is considered top tier right now, and despite the element receiving 3 new characters in version 4, none of them are particularly impressive enough to warrant consideration. Overall sentiments towards the element are at an all-time low across all discussion mediums, and there's been increasingly more and more attention being directed at the apparent lack of opportunity to pull for cryo units. Shunho is reaching close to 600 days without a rerun, with Ganyu not too far behind. Wristlight hasn't had a rerun yet, and it's been almost a year. If you count Chronicle Wish, Eula did get a rerun in 4.5, but her last personal rerun was over a year ago. Hoyo themselves have abandoned the element. But why? It's true that making cryo less dependent on freeze is easier said than done when so much was committed to the reaction already. It would be almost impossible to engineer a scenario where Ayaka can consistently proc melt, and I don't think they're ever going to care about superconduct in the physical niche as a whole. Then again, however, version 4 and early version 5 have proven that rogue strategies can and do work. They might not be able to retroactively make older characters work with melt, but they can sure as hell make newer characters do so. One option being the Chevreuse approach, encourage a party of Pyro and Cryo units. Alternatively, even though it might be counterintuitive to our preconceived notions of Cryo, they could just release a Cryo Screen Nuker. They never bothered to try. Just make a Cryo Mulan or a Cryo Hutal with the one-shot Cryo ultimate. As for the existing characters, I think the only way to fix this would be to artificially induce more power to them and them alone. Shunho was intended to be the flower son of Cryo, but in a similar fashion to Goro, I don't think she gives quite enough. Perhaps a Shunho 2.0 can work to bring Ayaka and Ganyu back into the fray, pumping them up with free stats and only them with free stats. Because if we're talking about a general support like Shilonen or Farina, you can use them for other teams, so the entire roster would just be inflated. Either that, or they could just let us freeze again. At this point, Genshin's character pool has expanded plenty enough to where the occasional freezable chamber won't really cause an issue with the meta. Part of me thinks Hoyo kind of overcorrected with Cryo. They gave less attention to Cryo and Pyro to give more exposure to Dendro and Electro throughout version 3, but while in version 4 they brought us excellent new additions to Pyro, by contrast the additions to Cryo weren't all that exciting, likely as a result of them playing into a dead element more or less. Presumably the next Cryo unit to come out is Silali, but we're not sure when she's coming out, I don't think. So I guess we have to just wait and see what they can do for the element, because with Shilonen spiking Geo up in status a ton, Cryo might just actually be the worst element in the game. I'm just surprised they let it get to this point. Ayaka, Ganyu, and Eula are 3 of the most popular waifus across Genshin's community. You would think they'd keep them in good form for appeasement if nothing else. I mean, for crying out loud, Ayaka was Hoyo's favorite, being the first character ever conceived, but only time will tell. What do you guys think about the Cryo element? Do you think it's GG for them, or is there something I forgot to mention? You're welcome to share in the comments. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other element discussions if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.